Of all the accomplishments in manned spaceflight, one stands out above all others in the eyes of history: the first man in space. As the race for space began, the United States underwent a very public campaign to promote their new Mercury astronauts, boasting that one of them would be the first to claim that honor. Meanwhile, the Soviet space program maintained an extreme level of secrecy. When technical issues and the strive for absolute perfection caused delays in America's launch schedule, Russia capitalized on the distraction and made an announcement that would shape the future of spaceflight forever. On April 12, 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin was carried into orbit in spacecraft Vostok 1. Though at the time details were kept secret, America not learning of the accomplishment until the mission was completed, and even other Soviet cosmonauts not knowing the identity of the first pilot until he was already in flight. Even so, Gagarin's assignment was of little surprise, however, as virtually all of the original 20 cosmonaut selectees had chosen Gagarin as their favorite. This was of course not the primary determining factor, as the final selection would come between Gagarin and German Titov, to which the head of cosmonaut training was having an increasingly difficult time choosing between. The final selection would come down to the upcoming flight schedule, as they wanted to save the physically stronger of the two for the planned day-long mission of Vostok 2. While this was technically choosing the lesser of the two for the first flight, Titov was understandably disappointed in not getting that first seat, and by the time of the decision, only Gagarin, Titov, and their backup Grigory Nelyubov would even know about it. Secrecy was intense, as was the pressure, as neither Gagarin nor Titov, nor the program manager Sergei Korolev got any sleep the night before. In the early morning hours, both Gagarin and Titov were fitted into their pressure suits and taken to the launch complex, where the Vostok-modified R-7 launch vehicle stood in Baikonur Cosmodrome. After hugs and handshakes all around, Gagarin boarded his spacecraft as the sun was rising, sealed into the spherical pressurized module, and communications system activated. Closing the hatch proved troublesome, as it would not seal properly, and necessitated an hour-long delay to fix. By this time, Korolev began suffering from chest pains as he began to suffer a nervous breakdown in the blockhouse. They were about to send a man whom they all loved and respected on an unproven vehicle. This would be the 24th R-7 launch, and thus far only 12 of them were successful, an exactly 50% success rate, and yet they were still going ahead with manned flight. Despite how nervous Korolev was, Gagarin remained calm and cool throughout, his heart rate reaching a brisk 64 beats per minute. The moment finally arrived. Launch control counted down, and the 5 clusters of engines began to bellow out streams of flame, and with the final launch command, those streams would burst into screaming jets, the 4 hold-down clamps releasing, opening like a giant maw, and the vehicle began to take to the sky. All 5 clusters would burn together for 2 minutes of powered flight before the 4 strap-ons exhaust their fuel and were blown free, first separating at the base before slipping free of the nose clamps and spreading out, much like the hold-down arms during initial takeoff, blossoming like the petals of a budding flower as the core stage pushed the vehicle further upward and downrange. 35 seconds later, the shroud that covered the vehicle was separated, giving Gagarin his first glimpse at the small window below his feet. A minute and a half afterward, the core stage exhausts its fuel and cuts away, allowing the smaller third stage engine to burn, boosting the spacecraft into its final leg of powered flight. The burn would last for 5 minutes before Vostok 1 finally reached orbit, separating from the final booster and deploying its antenna, Gagarin reporting that he was feeling fine and in good spirits. Virtually all radio and tracking stations were within the Soviet Union, so transmission was poor throughout most of the flight as he passed over the Pacific Ocean. With the orbit inclination the craft traveled in, its path would completely avoid all landmass of the entire Western Hemisphere, passing between Antarctica and the southernmost tip of South America as he passed into sunrise. For the entire flight, Gagarin could only report on his condition, look out the windows, or loosen his straps and float about the spherical cabin, as he had no physical control over his craft. everything was handled automatically, and he was little more than a passenger. However, he did have a method of gaining manual control if the situation warranted, but he never used it. As he began to reach Africa, the craft oriented itself to line its small retro engine with the direction of flight. The burn timing was controlled automatically, but it was certainly a tense moment, as he would not know if the system was even working until the engine fired. He would certainly have his eye on the manual trigger as the timer counted down, but as the timer hit 0, the engine fired and the craft began to slow toward descent. But even if the engine didn't fire, the situation wouldn't have been catastrophic, as the craft was equipped with just over 10 days of provisions to allow for the orbit to degrade. After the 42-second burn, commands were sent to trigger separation of the service module, and after the separation bolts fired, the module remained attached. The re-entry module was designed to survive the re-entry from virtually any angle, but this still attached module presented a problem should the remaining propellants ignite or debris puncture the hull, as the entire structure began to barrel and tumble as it streaked like a meteor over the skies of Egypt. Finally, the module broke away, and the spherical capsule settled into its normal attitude, the whole while Gagarin knowing nothing of this, assuming that it was the spherical shape that caused the odd gyrations. Finally, the heat of re-entry passed, and while 7 kilometers from the ground, the spacecraft hatch blows free, and per pre-planned automatic control, Gagarin was ejected from his craft. Both pilot and craft deploying parachutes properly and coming to a safe landing about 26 kilometers west of Engels in Saratov. Though this was still 280 kilometers from the planned landing site near Baikonur, they had planned for a potential off-course landing, and before the flight painted CCCP on his helmet, so anyone who encounters him could easily identify that he was a Soviet pilot and not an enemy. Though even so, the farmer and daughter who first encountered him reacted with fear, even as he shouted that he was a Soviet citizen, returning from space, and must find a telephone to call Moscow. This landing site is now an amusement park, intended to celebrate this first historic flight, and historic it was, as the entire world marveled at the accomplishment, though some out of jealousy. Regardless of how one may feel politically, it was a moment that indeed changed the world, and a defining point in the history of mankind just behind the landing upon the moon itself. Through innovation, inspiration, and tireless work by thousands, man was finally able to leave the bonds of Earth and travel beyond. And despite this being his only opportunity to do so, Yuri Gagarin will forever have his name etched into history as the first man to make this accomplishment. A moment that will forever mark this week in not only space history, but world history.